and welcome to the North American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. My guest today has devoted much of his life to researching food and its impact on the human body. He's creator of the world's first and only Dietary Inflammatory Index, and he has over 330 peer-reviewed papers in high-impact medical journals, with most of these focusing on various aspects of diet. I'd like to welcome Dr. James Hébert. Welcome, Dr. Hébert, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Thanks. And can you start by telling me a bit about your background?
Well, I can go pretty far back in time. So I grew up in a rural area, and one of the things that we did was grow a lot of our own food. So we would can food when I was very young, and I get very interested in the taste and flavor of food. But I also noticed that foods could change how I feel. So not just how I felt in terms of my health, but also my attitude and my mood and so forth. And another thing that was kind of interesting is I discovered that I would heal more quickly in the late summer and early fall than I did at other times of the year. Really? So I was an outdoor, I spent a lot of time outdoors, and I got injured a lot. And I would heal. I get injured a lot, but I also heal pretty quickly. And I would heal more quickly at the end of the summer and early fall. And it was only much more recently that I figured out that that has to do with the kinds of foods that were available at that time of year. Because as you know, coming from New York, that most of these fruits and vegetables become ripe in the fall.
Right.
And those are the most anti-inflammatory of all the foods. And inflammation is a very important process through which your body deals with infections and heals wounds and so forth.
Wow. Yeah. So then is that what inspired you to become a doctor then in this area?
Well, yes, indirectly. I mean, there were other salient events in my life. I remember I had a fourth grade teacher who, and I thought at the time, this is really interesting. I was in the fourth grade, so I didn't know how to evaluate what he was saying, but he said, you can get cancer by wearing a belt too tight and having it chafe you.
Really?
That is really, that's interesting. And I just filed it away in my fourth grade brain. And it was years later that I sort of put two and two together, and I realized, oh, that's about inflammation and inflammatory responses. And we now know that epithelial cancers are caused by inflammation. And this was something that Virchow, wrote about in the mid-19th century. Wow. That inflammation is on the pathway to causing cancer. He was concerned with cancer, but also heart disease and, many other chronic diseases.
Wow. So what is the Dietary Inflammatory Index?
The Dietary Inflammatory Index is a way to actually grade and score foods according to their ability to cause chronic systemic inflammation. So when we say inflammation, when we're talking about inflammation, a lot of people are interested in inflammation these days. The problem inflammation, just like the problem stress, is chronic inflammation, just like chronic stress. So stress is a really good metaphor for this. So if you are in the world and you need to escape danger, or you're playing a sport and you need to react quickly, you want a really good, quick stress response. You want a really good fight or flight response. And it's the same thing with inflammation. So those things, those foods and other things that cause chronic systemic inflammation actually produce the opposite effect with the quick, acute inflammatory response that we need when we're presented with imminent danger. So when when I'm talking about inflammation, the problem inflammation is this chronic systemic inflammation. So I want to be really clear about that, because people say, oh, that's so interesting. Then it's really good to be, if you need an inflammatory response, then it must be good to be constantly inflamed. And I go, wrong. It's like, the analogy there would be to a child. If you teach a child to be afraid of everything and they're hyper vigilant, they're going to be vigilant about nothing. Right. And it's the same way with the inflammation in the immune system. If you're constantly on alert, if you're in this constant state of chronic systemic inflammation, you will not be able to mount a competent immune or inflammatory response.
Right. Well, that makes sense. Even handling animals, that if they're at
Yeah.
high stress, then they're not going to move. But if you have the right pressure at the right time, then you can make them move.
Yes. Yes. It's so explaining it in that way to people, I think it connects really well to real life experience. People go,
Mhm.
oh yeah, if I freak my kid out and the kid's hyper vigilant, the kid will not be ready for danger when it really comes.
Right.
So this is completely analogous to that.
Wow. So how can what we eat reduce inflammation in our bodies?
Well, there are categories of foods that are inherently anti-inflammatory. In other words, they would suppress this chronic systemic inflammation, and they would promote the ability to mount that quick response. And when I say quick, I mean really quick. So if I were to, cut myself right now, I'm not going to do that, but were I to do that,
Mhm.
um, my skin would immediately turn red. You would see some of the hallmarks of inflammation immediately. What are the hallmarks of inflammation? Redness, swelling, pain, and heat, right? So those things will happen quickly, like in a matter of a nanosecond. So when you have an infection, you'll have the neutrophils, these cells in the immune system, go and deal with the site of the attack literally within nanoseconds. I mean, it is instantaneous. And typically the problem's resolved within around 72, 96 hours.
Mhm.
The healing is pretty much done by that point.
Right.
And so that's the time scale. And the foods that would tend to be the most anti-inflammatory also tend to be the most colorful and flavorful.
Mhm.
So
Wow.
that's a really interesting way to think about it. Those things that are, spices, for example, are anti-inflammatory.
Mhm.
Um, Many dark, green vegetables, peppers, among the fruits, the darkest fruits are the most anti-inflammatory.
Oh, that's
Blueberry,
interesting.
blackberry being really good examples.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are also high in antioxidants.
Correct.
Well, right.
There's
And so
right.
does
So
that work
there's
together?
they do. They're
Mm.
so something that is an oxidant will be pro-inflammatory.
Wow.
So there isn't a perfect correlation, but they're strongly related. Yeah.
Wow. And then why is addressing this inflammation important to our health? Why should we pay attention to this?
Because every single malady that affects human beings builds on the substrate of inflammation.
Okay.
So when, 2 years ago, I would have said, or a year and a half ago even, I would have said, well, it's just chronic diseases. And that would have been good enough because that's what people were worried about. They're worried about cancer and type 2 diabetes and heart disease.
Mhm.
But now we have COVID-19. And it also applies to infectious diseases, obviously.
Wow. Yeah.
So an infectious disease is typically dealt with very quickly, on that, hours or so time scale. But that's true also chronic diseases. So, while we're having this talk today, I'm probably having hundreds of mutations.
Hmm.
And my immune system is detecting them and dealing with them, and I'm not having cancer as a consequence of that.
Right. That's incredible. Everyday life, you don't really think about these things, right?
You shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
You should be aware that your
Mhm.
behavior conditions how you respond. But again, you
Mhm.
shouldn't be freaking out about it. You should just, live your life in a sensible way, eating a reasonable, balanced diet, getting physical activity, not smoking, not drinking in
Yeah.
excess, and so forth.
Right. Yeah. So how is the DII inflammation food grade used?
Well, so we designed the inflammatory index as a way to assess the inflammatory effect of the whole diet.
Okay.
So that was our intention. Our intention was to take humans' diets and describe them in terms of their inflammatory potential. The food grade system is a derivative of that because and I don't want to get too much into the technical details here, but when we devised the DII for individuals, the caloric denominator is the entire diet.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found when we were looking at DII scores is that the scores tended to go down as people ate more food. And we said, well, that's interesting
Mm-hmm.
because energy itself, calories themselves are pro-inflammatory. Why would that be? And it's because of the correlation among things in your diet. So as you eat more food, you eat more of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So the tendency on average is for your DII score to go down. So it became very important for us to control for total energy intake. Because what we were finding was that men who eat slightly worse diets than women on average were having lower DII scores. That's really weird.
Yeah.
So we actually had to figure out a way to energy adjust the DII score, creating the EDI, the energy adjusted DII score. And in the process of that, figured out how to deal with what I'll call the energy denominator that we would then be able to use to describe the energy or the inflammatory potential of a food item of a prescribed amount, say 250 calories or 500 calories, something like that. So the food grade system is a derivative of the DII. It's a way to apply what we learned based on whole diet to particular foods and menus and recipes and things like that.
Wow. Wow. And you have classes and courses on all of this, right?
Yes. In fact, I taught a nutritional epidemiology, my first session of this semester's nutritional epidemiology course this morning.
Wow, that's good. And can people, go to the website to find more?
Yeah, we have a website. So our company is called Connecting Health Innovations, LLC. And we also have a website for our diet intervention, which is called imaginehealthy.org.
That's great. And now, we'll kind of shift gears a little bit towards more of an agriculture focus.
Sure.
So how does the method of how food is grown impact how it reduces inflammation?
Yeah, that's a really good question and extremely hard to answer. And it's analogous to the question of, are organic foods better for you? My presumption is everything else being equal, organic foods are better for you because they don't have all these contaminants. The thing is, it's hard enough to measure the effect of diet on health without considering intentional and unintentional additives and contaminants and things like that. So I don't think we know the answer to that question based on scientific literature. So for example, when it comes to the question about organic food, really the first study to show a specific effect of organically grown foods on health was one done by a French group and published last year. So there are 1.5 million articles out there in the medical literature, and that's the only one that I know of on the effect of organic food. So my guess is the method of production probably matters, because if you're doing composting, if you're putting a lot of organic material back into the soil, you're going to be replenishing micronutrients. Whereas if you're just extracting and replacing with chemical fertilizers, for example, you wouldn't be replacing those micronutrients.
Okay.
And as I said at the beginning of this interview, I grew up in the country and we had cow manure all over the place. And we composted and we didn't need to fertilize much because, there was no need to, because things got replenished. So my guess is, and we just finished writing a book that'll be published in the fall by Elsevier Press. My guess is that first of all, this is an issue. But we don't understand the scale of it because we haven't done good research into it. And that would be one of the things that we're recommending, is that people spend more time and expend more resources into answering this question, because it's a really important question to answer.
Right. Yeah. And so how can producers target this market of anti-inflammatory food with their products that they're growing currently, or by pivoting some of the things that they're growing, some of the crops?
Well, we can score the foods based on, the description of the food. So we don't ask the question of, how the food was grown. Was it grown with, organic manure? Was it, inorganic material, inputs? So we can compute a DIS score based on the blueberries or the blackberries you bring us, and we don't take that into consideration. Now, what you could do from an analytics, so I'm also a statistician type scientist. So what you could do, and what we have done, and we've done this with supplements, for example, is we would analyze the data based on the DII score from from the foods as you present them to us.
Mhm.
And then if we had additional information on, say, how they were grown, we could include that information and see if there was an independent effect of that or a multiplicative effect of that.
Right.
So there are ways to do that would enable analyzing the data and answer the question, but it wouldn't change the DII score. You'd still have the DII score in the analysis, and then you'd have the method of growth in the analysis. So you could find, for example, oh, there's a strong effect of a low DII score in this particular health outcome, and it was amplified by the food having been grown organically, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. And farmers have been able to leverage the organic market, especially over the last decade or so.
Yes.
So do you think that they could do that the same thing using your guidelines and what you're teaching about anti-inflammatory food?
Yeah, well, people would, well, I was going to say, well, people who are inclined to grow food that way would be growing foods that are low DI, but that's not necessarily true. There was an article that I read in Science magazine probably 40 years ago by a guy by the name of Barry Lockritz, who showed that organically grown corn in the Midwest, monoculture corn, was actually grew at higher yields than conventional corn, or corn grown conventionally. So it would apply to basically any crop. And like I said, it wouldn't modify the DII score at all, but it would probably change the nutrient content. And again, this is something that we should figure out. But when we analyze our data, for example, it's the data are derived from food tables, food and nutrient tables. And these, it takes tens of years, I mean, literally decades to accumulate the data, and they don't change much. So, you can find a hamburger, for example, in the USDA database, and it may be from ingredients from 1950,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
And
it makes perfect. It makes no sense, but on the one hand, but it makes perfect sense on the other hand. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think are some of the greatest opportunities that we're learning about food today? You read these things that, you see on media, and it seems like everything's changing all the time. But what are you seeing that's a great opportunity?
What I remind people is, the literature on diet and health is huge. There are about 1.5 million articles in the National Library of Medicine on these subjects. So yes, there is a tendency for people to get hysterical about particular results, but we've known a lot about the general prescription for quite a long time. So I don't think there's as much confusion as the gadflies would like to have us believe.
Right.
I think one of the frontier areas that's really important is the area of olfaction, smell, aroma, flavor, because those foods that tend to be the most anti-inflammatory also tend to be the most aromatic and flavorful.
Really?
Yeah. So not only are they colorful, but they also tend to have a lot of flavor and taste. And I mean taste in a broad sense, not just the 5 basic tastes. So those foods that are anti-inflammatory are colorful and flavorful, nutrient dense, and calorie sparse. And we should be able to use that effectively to tickle that part of our brain that processes the sensations of taste and smell, which is the same part of our brain that processes basic emotion and instinctual behavior.
Wow.
So we have not been very clever at dealing with that. We've been fairly stupid in that way. So I think that's a frontier area. Another frontier area is what we were just talking about in terms of, organic fertilizer and replenishing soils and stuff like that. Because, if you're depleting soil of micronutrients and not replacing them, eventually you'll get to a point where people start having micronutrient deficiencies, especially people who are eating diets that tend to be high DII, very pro-inflammatory, because they're not going to have a lot of those natural the foods that would naturally have those things in them in the first place.
Yeah. So
I think that's another frontier area. And also to think about heat sensitivity and stuff like that. So some of these crops grow well in the tropics, and the world is becoming more tropical, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
So we should start thinking about, what it will take to grow certain foods in certain environments. heat is one issue, heat stress, and there's a whole literature I'm not a plant scientist, but in the agricultural world, when people talk about heat stress, it's very different than what people like me think of. Also water, salinity, stuff like that. I think those are all frontier areas that we really need to be focusing on.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot, so much more to learn.
Yes.
And the more we learn, the more there is to learn, right?
Yes.
And the more
as we're learning, we can apply as well.
Yeah.
So I'm getting a little bit older, not much older, a little bit older. So, I think, we should feel compelled to make sure that the research we do gets put into action.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So wow, that's really fascinating. And so I have one last question for you. What gets you out of bed in the morning? Why are you doing what you do?
Well, it depends on the day,
Yeah.
So normally I get out of bed and I just start interacting with colleagues from all over the world, because we've as of now, I've published 810 papers. So the information is a little bit old. So we're publishing papers like at the highest rate of any group in the world. And we're not one group. So, I've got colleagues in 54 countries. And so my colleagues are always awake. It's like the old British Empire. The sun never sets on it, Somebody's always, so it's partly it's largely my interactions with people. And I met these people and became colleagues with these people because they also want to save the world and improve both environmental health and human health. So that's what unites us. And then, I like to play squash in the morning, so that helps me get out of bed. I make sure I'm up and about by about 5:15 or so I can get my little bit of work done at home and then get on the squash court by 7:00 or so.
Yeah.
So those things get me out of bed, and I think about the way the world is going. And I have a daughter who lives in Europe and is in her early 30s and is working with the fisheries over there. And I think, well, we got to preserve these resources, because I don't want to be the last generation, or even for her to be the last generation. So we're here to save the world for humans. I have no doubt the world will survive us.
Yes.
Right? I'm not so sure that will survive us. So that's a lot of what I'm about, is to make sure that we do a good job of taking care of one another and the source of it all.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. That's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of things that I haven't thought about before. And it makes sense, though. If you're thinking about feeding cattle, you feed a dairy cow completely different than how you feed a beef cow, right? So the same is for us. And if there's any opportunities in agriculture, I think that's great.
Yeah, we work a lot with producers. So one of the things that I've gotten involved with, in the recent past, is the Southeast Produce Council, for example. So yeah, we're working a lot with producers, and it's an interesting world, and there's a lot of problems, but a lot of opportunity out there too.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again. And thanks to all who are watching or listening. If you want more information, the links are provided in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to our North American Egg Spotlight on our YouTube and Rumble channels. And the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Amazon, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And have a great day.
Thank you.